Welcome back to Higher Exchanges. I'm your host, Jesse Redmond, Head of Investor Relations and Business Development at Leaf Brands. I'm here this week and every week with Morgan Paxia. He is the co-founder of Poseidon. Morgan, what's going on, man? It's been a long time.
It has been a long time. I'm in the Cannabis Witness Protection Program, as you can tell by my background at the moment. So, yeah, I'm doing.
I thought you chose me for your one call from jail was the first thing that I thought.
But yeah, no, doing all right, hanging in there. How about you?
I'm good, man. Yeah, kind of the same. Been running around a lot. Was at the Bitcoin conference, which we can talk about last week, here this week, and then heading out to Benzinga next week. And going on the road is kind of a double-edged sword because you lose the time when you're at the conferences, and then you have all the catch-up work to do when you get back. So I felt, it's felt hectic and under pressure for the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's conference season, right? I mean, it seems like that, or at least in the financial world, but even for us a bit here. For us, has also been the board meeting season, with Q1 wrapping up and, going through tons of that stuff. So been traveling a bit myself and getting back into the groove. So it's pretty wild. We're already into September, almost halfway through this year. It's going fast.
Time does fly. And you guys had some news out the other day, didn't you, Morgan, about a deal that you guys got done?
Yeah, this is a deal we closed in Connecticut. It was a 3-store deal, buying from Botanist, which was acreage, sold off their Connecticut footprint, and we were part of the financing to consolidate that with an existing operator called Butter, BUDR. Great team, great existing stores, and they're doing a good job in the state. So with this combination, that puts them as the second largest in the state, second to is it Fine Fettle, I think is how you say it. So yeah, I'm very excited for them. Been working on that for several months now. As you know, getting anything done in cannabis takes some time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you when you started working on that, because by doing the Glasshouse deal, I got a firsthand view of how long these things can take. It all looks simple when it's done, but there's so many details along the way.
One takeaway real quick before we jump into things, I'd say, is having good government relations is so helpful. And the team at Butter have really good relations with the state of Connecticut. And so that really helped facilitate the license transfer. So it was a nice, easy transition of ownership and operations. So didn't miss a minute from an operation standpoint, which is obviously very important for the customer. And to keep going, and so they're off to the races, which is great.
That's awesome.
So yeah.
When did you start working on that deal?
The end of last year.
Okay, yeah, I was gonna guess beginning of this year. Yeah, so it took 5 or 6 months.
Yeah. And it was, we were all pretty efficient, but obviously, buying from an operator, just getting through all the diligence and final documents, and just it takes some time. So
yeah,
but yeah, very happy with the end result, and excited for those guys. And I think we'll as we're already seeing this, I'm a big fan for some of these struggling groups not to try to do the package deal, because when you try to sell off everything, it's just so hard, versus if you can do things in pieces, much better.
Yeah, it seems like sometimes they start off with the package deal and then give up and end up doing it in pieces.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that here in the state of California, right? They're still trying to do package deals, and what happens is they're just stuck in purgatory.
Yep.
They're still, I guess, operating, like State House and Gold Flora. They're still operating, but who's going to come in and take the whole thing? Remains to be seen, because it's just the dollar amounts needed, and all the different assets that most are not wanted, and you sell what you can and just wind down the rest if you can. So but it seems obviously the bankers want the whole package deal, and if they can sell it, great, because they just get that much more commish. But harder to find the buyers that want to take that on, because if it failed, what are they going to do differently? Because there's still all the problems that remain, and they a lot of cleanup work. So all the additional capital, not just the purchase price, there's a lot to factor in.
Yep. And I should have said off the top that Morgan is in a new location. We won't be too specific, but Morgan stayed in the greater San Diego area. So if you guys do watch us on video and we're joking about Morgan's background, that is because he did move to a new location there. So he's getting that dialed in. And then I'm in the same old spot here, but have a new microphone. So if I sound different, if things look a little bit different, hopefully it's better on the sound side. But a couple of changes on the production end this week that I should have covered up
That's
top.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. I'm going to call you NPR Jesse now because your voice is so calm and smooth.
I know. I did a voiceover for something we were doing, some content we were putting out for Leap, and I went back and listened. I'm like, oh, I'm like, is that actually what I sound like, or is the other mic actually what I sound like? Because I'm getting confused at this point.
You're really moonlighting a jazz station on Sirius XM, aren't you?
Smooth jazz. No, it's I think that's the whole hating your own voice thing, and we'll move on here quickly, guys. Don't worry. But the hating your own voice thing is fascinating. Like some reason, I think we're programmed to all hate our own voice. And, I think we both listen back to a bunch of our content over time, and eventually you get used to it. You just accept it is what it is. And maybe the really good voiceover guys do like their voice, but I still cringe a little bit every time I hear myself talk.
Yeah, just like everything, you get used to it after a while. It doesn't bother me anymore. It used to bother me a bunch too, but yeah, I don't know. So, but anyway, I would like to start off the show this week, as you mentioned, talking about where you were last week. You were in Vegas at a crypto conference, and I think this is really interesting to discuss for a couple of reasons. One, as we're seeing with a lot of our companies, especially like more of the service type companies, they continue to drive forward in cannabis, but they're also, seeing some growth or, crossover that's starting to happen in other areas. And crypto has been an area that's been long talked about as, how do these two, Venn diagram, how do these two overlap at some point? And I think you guys are the first to establish Bitcoin Reserve and really starting to get more active in it. We're hearing more talk about, obviously, stablecoin is being talked about almost every single day. I saw Uber is now starting to look at taking stablecoin payments. There was a huge IPO today, Circle, right? That was a monster win for an IPO, and that's a stablecoin company. And I know that's just one facet of the crypto landscape. But really curious to see how we start to grow into each other's worlds a bit more. And so, you guys tell us about what was going on last week and how did it go for Leaf? Because I'm really curious.
Yeah, so I think I'll delineate off the top. We're specifically interested in Bitcoin. So crypto is obviously a broader term that incorporates some other, more blue chip stuff like Ethereum, but also includes Fartcoin and Trump coin and just a bunch of garbage that we have no interest in. So Leaf Brands is specifically interested in using Bitcoin and accumulating Bitcoin. And so the conference we went to was the Bitcoin 2025 conference. And just a bit of context, late last year, we started taking Bitcoin payments on a B2B basis. So if we sell a bunch of our extracts to a brand in California, they could pay us in Bitcoin for those. And we also take them in our dispensary. So if somebody buys some flower for $80 at our dispensary in Palm Desert, they could pay in Bitcoin. So that's two ways we're kind of integrating Bitcoin into the business, and through that we've accumulated a few coins and have had nice timing and are up nicely on those initial investments. And we've also been looking to raise more capital to buy Bitcoin to put it on the balance sheet and strengthen it. We think it's a liquid asset that will appreciate substantially over time, and so we think we can improve our balance sheet by whether it's equity, debt, convert, there's different mechanisms by which we could do it, but through some sort of a financing mechanism to put more Bitcoin on our balance sheet. So I'd say we're early in terms of cannabis as being the lead adopter so far, but I'd say for our plans, we're just kind of getting started. In terms of go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple follow-ups on that, because that's really interesting about that you guys are already active in payments. How big of a obviously understand being a pubco, so if you can't disclose, it's totally understandable. But I was just curious from like a B2B payments, what is there like a percentage idea of like what is coming in via Bitcoin versus cash? Is it material, immaterial?
Yeah, so I think we've talked about this public. We've accumulated about 4 coins from B2B transactions, and so Bitcoin trading
Okay.
around $100,000. That's a few $100,000 that we've accumulated there. So we're a company that does 30 something million in revenue each year. So not a big part of it. We're starting to see more adoption that way, and we're starting to make more effort to let our brand partners know they can pay us this way. So we're kind of early in terms of letting people know about that and taking transactions that way. So enough to get a few coins, but not a huge part of our business yet.
Okay. And it's only Bitcoin, like you said.
Yep.
So if they wanted to pay with anything else, you say you got to deal with that, get it, convert it over, or exchange it over to Bitcoin, and then you can pay us.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. In
Only
the
because
conference last week, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, please.
I was going to say in the conference last week was just Bitcoin, nothing else.
It was just Bitcoin, correct. It was like the Benzinga of Bitcoin, but at a way larger scale. Like instead of a few thousand people at Benzinga, you had, I think, over 35,000 people at the Bitcoin conference.
Got it.
Yeah.
What and just going into that now, so when you say 35,000, like we ask about it at any of our industry shows, like how many of them were retail folk, how many of them were in the business, how many of them were institutional capital, like what was kind of the mix?
Yeah, so it spanned the whole spectrum. Bitcoin is interesting because it tends to draw a more innovative, unique crowd, kind of like cannabis, but in a different way. So you saw like a lot of nerdy tech, computer geeky guys with the orange glasses and the Bitcoin shirts, and it's easy to laugh at those guys, but they probably were in Bitcoin in 2014 and have like 50 coins or something like that. So there's a lot of the early adopters that probably come from the tech world, just because I think that broadly speaking, they were quicker to understand it and to get involved. So there are a lot of individuals. What was really cool for me, Morgan, kind of like what you saw at the Buffett thing, is there were families there where you saw a mom and dad and a couple of teenage kids. So I thought it was kind of cool to get them out there and get them educated. So you saw individuals, you saw families, you saw a lot of family offices, like that middle market is pretty hot, and you definitely did see institutions there. And kind of taking a step back from this, I think it's worth explaining why we're interested in Bitcoin, because we talk about this online sometimes, and it usually leads to a few snarky comments about this being a Ponzi scheme, or there's some nefarious reason for getting involved in Bitcoin. And I'm similar to you, Morgan. We're similar ages. We both have backgrounds in, finance. I spent 20 years in the investment industry. And I remember before even COVID, people talking about Bitcoin, and I just kind of shook my head and was very dismissive and almost condescending to them. And, shout out to my friends like Josh. I have a friend named Deke too, if you guys are listening, where back then I was like, you guys are going to lose all your money. There's no way to value this. This is a bubble. And it turned out I just hadn't spent the time. And I think that's true of a lot of people with Bitcoin. There's a common phrase that it takes about 100 hours, to really understand what Bitcoin. And by that time, you never go back. And I would say I'm 50, 60, 70 hours in that journey. And I'd say the more I learn, the more that I get interested. And if I were to explain why I think it's such an interesting asset, it's because of the supply and demand equation. And that's ultimately, what drives asset pricing. And so when you look at, stocks, right, Morgan, we hate dilution. We hate when there's more shares, right? There can be accretive dilution, but generally speaking, we like things with more fixed supply, because then when the demand goes up, the price will go up. What do you think about the US dollar? Since, 2020, I believe, 40% of the dollars in circulation have been printed in the last 5 years, so maybe off a year or two on that. But we've seen a massive increase in the money supply. And really, Bitcoin is a solution to the fiat problem about constant debasement. And so, around the world, especially in, a lot of the poorer countries, you just see this rampant inflation. And we've experienced, a more moderate version, but still substantial over the last few years, especially since we were giving out free money back in the COVID era. And with Bitcoin, one of the things that we like about it, Morgan, is it has a fixed supply. So there will be 21 million Bitcoin. And today, 19.7 million of those have been mined. And the last coin will be mined in 2140. And so there's just something I won't get into deeply called the halving cycle, and miners get rewards, and more Bitcoin is slowly created. But the key takeaway is they have 21 million Bitcoin and 19.7 have been mined. And so there's not a heck of a lot more Bitcoin left. And so that's programmed and it's a fixed supply. And guys, I'm like in martial arts terms, I'm a white belt in Bitcoin that maybe has one stripe and hasn't gotten his blue belt yet. So for any serious Bitcoiners, I want to come at this with a sense of humility that I'm just getting up the curve on this after 6 months of working pretty hard. So I'll try to get the big picture here, right? But I just wanted to offer that caveat off the top that I'm not here claiming I'm the Bitcoin expert. I'm just somebody trying to share some stuff and get up the curve. So we have this working where there's 21 million Bitcoin out there, but the true float is even less. It's estimated to be about 9 to 10 million because of coins that have been lost, institutions, and long-term holders. So fixed supply with even a smaller float. And so that's cool, but on the other side of that, you need rising demand to drive those higher prices. And this is where I think the analogy to cannabis kind of comes in a little bit more, which is Bitcoin is seeing the increasing institutional demand that we felt like we were on the precipice of last year, and then no Florida, no Schedule 3, that's diminished quite a bit. And so when I talk about institutional demand for Bitcoin, it's at the country level. So there's 4 countries so far, the US, Pakistan, Bhutan, and El Salvador, that have established Bitcoin reserves. There's a bunch of other countries, including places like the Czech Republic and Russia, that are actively exploring similar programs. And I think over time, you'll see China continue to accumulate more. You'll see the wealthy countries in the Middle East continue to accumulate more. And someone at the conference made the analogy about New York real estate, where you have a fixed supply and a lot of the wealthier nations across the country just, bought the real estate and don't even use it, but like having the fixed supply asset appreciating. 3 states, New Hampshire, Texas, and Arizona, have established Bitcoin reserve programs. There's 20 others that are pondering it. So that's almost about half the nation is pondering adding Bitcoin at the state level. And then there's 124 public companies that are accumulating Bitcoin. The biggest, which many listeners will know, is Strategy, that is 61 billion in Bitcoin. Tesla has a Bitcoin reserve. And Trump Media and Technology even announced plans to make a $2.5 billion investment in Bitcoin. And so at the highest level, I think one of the things that's unique, attractive, and exciting about Bitcoin is that fixed supply part, the increasing institutional adoption. And like I said, it kind of feels like cannabis, where we're at the precipice of getting that. And I think Bitcoin is kind of at that tipping point where it's about to go over.
So, playing on the cannabis analogy, and thinking about our competitive landscape, we're having issues around illicit market activity. You could argue, some could argue, what's going on with some of the bad actors in the hemp side of things. That's all kind of diluting activity in the legal market. Is kind of a similar position of Bitcoin versus, as you mentioned, the other shitcoins, like shitcoins rather, where you would prefer to see all of those go away, and there really only being one crypto being Bitcoin, because to your point is Bitcoin is a fixed supply, but there are limitless of others that pop up, in the crypto space. And so is that a kind of a similar idea? Is that like most of that will shake out, and by and far Bitcoin will be like 80% of the crypto market, and taking stablecoin aside, because that doesn't matter. That's just dollars.
Yeah.
It's just digital dollars.
Yeah, I feel a bit unqualified to answer that one. I mean, take what we did versus what Flora Growth did. And so Flora Growth added crypto to their balance sheet, but I think they did it with Ethereum, Ripple, maybe Solana. And so, if Bitcoin is a tier 1 coin, to use cannabis terms, those strike me as kind of tier 2 type coins. And I don't honestly know the nuances of all of those and have strong opinions about them. And then maybe a level below that, you have the meme coins and the shit coins, and maybe some of those have some utility that I don't understand. But I think the analogy is fairly fair. I think generally speaking, we're looking for good actors and good long-term investments. And so, the Ethereums, the Solanas, the Ripples of the world, they may embody those traits more. I just don't know. But in terms of, I would say, yeah, the Bitcoin community isn't generally a fan of the meme stuff and the fart coins of the world because, yeah, generally speaking, they're looking for the more serious institutional adoption and getting away from the pump and dump stuff that tends to paint Bitcoin with a bad brush.
Right. And from your purposes, you're doing it more when you're talking about payments is really more just to collect it. You're not looking to use it as a currency. You're looking to use it as a balance sheet matter.
Yes. Any Bitcoin that we accumulate, we would like to hold as long as possible. It's nice that it's a liquid asset. And so if you did have something come up where you needed the money, but our idea is we want to put Bitcoin on the balance sheet and hold it for several years and have it appreciate.
Is that the similar kind of general consensus from like the Bitcoin conference is how people are viewing it is for purposes of accumulation?
Yep.
I mean, it seems like the biggest argument is around debasement, around because the dollar, just keeps getting printed into oblivion, running 7% deficits, blah blah blah, and this is like a way, and this is perceived as the ultimate or the top tool to protect against that.
Yeah, I was looking at my notes here, and I can't find the quote right now, but I believe someone at the conference said Bitcoin is the only, fixed supply currency in the world. And so, yeah, your point there is exactly right, Morgan. If you get deep in the Bitcoin world, the words debasement and fiat come up all the time because every year the dollars you own get to be worth less. And every year they're printing more. And every year we have this deficit. And every year we are battling inflation. And, the rate at which the money supply is increasing, if you look at the graph, it's just going up and up and up. And it's a good solution for governments to always be able to print money. But if you're at the other end of the printing machine, it's not super awesome. You just continue to lose purchasing power. And so what if you had an algorithmic system like Bitcoin, which is essentially a computer program or a software protocol that had a fixed supply. So you knew exactly what how much was coming out and when, and you had that option rather than something that continues to debase you over time. And I think that simple point, and I've heard sophisticated hedge fund managers, come around on this and saying, for a long time, I was thrilled the S&P was going up 10%. But, when we're printing money at this rate, that's just being driven, by inflation, and your actual purchasing power isn't changed very much. And so in the Bitcoin community, people that you talk to, people are not there for a trade. I didn't hear anyone talking about selling Bitcoin. I didn't hear anyone talk about a price target of like, oh, 200,000, I'm out. Like that community expects Bitcoin, to go to several $1 million. We're at $100,000 today. And so the talk of $1 million Bitcoin is fairly common. And have you heard this phrase hodl or hodl, Morgan, HODL?
Yes, I am familiar with the hodl world.
Yeah. And so
that's how I feel about stocks, but yeah, same idea.
Yeah. And so that's the mentality is people just want to, hold on for dear life. And, that's the mentality of the Bitcoin community is people want to accumulate and get as much as they can and spend their fiat money and use that for liquidity and just hoard the Bitcoin as much as possible.
So one more question on that is, to your point about it, as a hedge against debasement. So, Bitcoin's had a volatile history in its emergence into the mainstream adoption. Is it the view from the conference is that over time that volatility subsides and really the way to measure its appreciation is basically an inverse of debasement, like when people talk about 1 million Bitcoin, to your point is that just a measurement of as dollars depreciate and that's what you'd expect for appreciation? Why would it, if it's truly that's what it's for, why would it appreciate more and faster? And is it just because the demand side is overwhelming the supply side?
Yes.
And so wouldn't that over time correct to that long-term trend? And I'm just thinking about also to your point about in the context of stocks. I mean, stocks over any long-term horizon, long-term, truly long-term, is like 8 to 10%. So, what is kind of the thought around, cryptos or Bitcoin specifically is long-term return prospects after because we still have these short-term, call it short to medium-term potential supply-demand imbalances, too much demand relative to supply. So we could see some, big pops, but potentially some corrections. But, just trying to get a sense of that.
Yeah, so everyone expects Bitcoin to continue to be volatile and to have substantial drawdowns. And so if I were a Bitcoin investor, I would be thinking, I used one of my first jobs as being what they call an investment counselor at Fisher Investments. And so I used to work with their high net worth and institutional clients talking about, expectations of managing their investments. And we used to always tell them that over the long term for something like the S&P, you can get a 10% return, but to harvest that, be prepared to sit for a 50% drawdown. And that's been pretty true over time. And so with Bitcoin, the expectation is it for it to be more volatile. And I heard people talking about, being prepared for maybe smaller drawdowns than we've seen in the past, but substantial drawdowns. So 50% plus, 60, 70% drawdowns, I think are something that the community there expects. And we can't go into it now because I don't have time and I really don't understand it well enough, but there's something called the Bitcoin halving cycle, which tends to drive the volatility. And there's certain years in that cycle, which over time have been the more volatile, downside years. So I think that's another reason people tend to look at Bitcoin as a better long-term investment, unless you want to be cute and, try and time the trading side of it. But the community expects a lot of volatility, but volatility isn't always a bug, right? Volatility can be, a feature and a helpful thing. It's all about, how you harness it. And so, volatility cuts both ways. And if you want an investment that's going to appreciate substantially, you need to expect in most cases to have some, significant, drawdowns along the way. That's generally how things work. But to your prior point, Morgan, with the S&P, you have things like earnings, right? Earnings power, discounted cash flows, things like that tend to, drive the long-term performance of the stocks. With Bitcoin, it's really just more of a qualitative supply and demand assessment. And I think the people with the very optimistic views that Bitcoin is going to be, over $1 million in a few years is based on that notion of the fixed supply and increasing demand. And it sounds very simple, but I think the way I get more convicted in it is by better understanding through reading some books, listening to dozens of podcasts, and going to conferences like this about the ongoing problems with other currencies. And when people wake up and really understand, how much debasement we're seeing, how much inflation we're seeing, and that the long-term program for the government, is generally speaking here and other places to, print more money. I think once people wake up to that, the idea is that more and more of those people are going to go to Bitcoin, and that's going to drive the price higher. So it's not something that I'm aware, people out there really presenting fancy models on. I think you can speculate about who will adopt and when and how much they'll buy and what that will do to prices. But it's really kind of understanding the flaws in the fiat system and the strengths in the Bitcoin system, and making a qualitative assessment of how many people from this pond you think jump over to this pond. And when they jump over to this pond, the Bitcoin pond, there aren't that many coins that are left. There aren't that many coins, period. About half those coins are, tied up in one way or the other with long-term holders are lost. And so as more of that money piles in over here to this limited supply asset, it's going to go up substantially over time.
Right. And so, bringing back to cannabis, I mean, to your point, it's like you're largely just looking to accumulate, build up a balance sheet of it. If others in cannabis do the same, then it's not really a function to, because if it's not a transaction function for cannabis, I'm just trying to think of the other benefits other than just your point of like, just for purposes of owning something outside of dollars on your balance sheet. But, what else would cannabis companies want to be using it for other than that?
Yeah, so I think there are benefits on the transaction side, on the payments side, and I think that we would, live in a more efficient world if we did more of the transactions that way. But I really think what it comes down to, Morgan, is that most cannabis companies' balance sheets are fucked. And the longer we go on without political progress, the more fucked they get. Pardon my language. And, I think one thing we've talked about with, earning seasons and everything else, and the lack of political progress and the generally mediocre performance from the larger cannabis companies, is the longer this environment persists, the worse it's going to get. So when it does turn around, you're going to have companies where growth resumes at some point, but they're going to still have this huge amount of debt on their balance sheet. And so we see Bitcoin as an appreciating asset that you can stick on your balance sheet and hopefully have it go up 2, 3, 4, 5. If we talk about $1 million, that's a 10x type investment. I don't know what's a fair time frame under which that happens. But if you have the capital, if you're the GTIs and you have the capital, you're someone else and you raise the capital, you stack millions of Bitcoin on the balance sheet. Let's say, Morgan, you put 10 million and Bitcoin were to double in value. That's a huge improvement to your balance sheet while still remaining in a liquid asset. And so I think that's why you've seen over 125 companies start to put Bitcoin on the balance sheet, is you can maintain the liquidity while having an appreciating asset that you could actually take on debt, but over time improve your balance sheet is the concept.
Right. And sorry, one more, and then I'm done.
You're good.
Is so because of the volatility and because it's on the balance sheet, and for companies that have debt and they have covenants, do you think that's a limiting factor with how much they can take on, so it doesn't create too much volatility in their balance sheet that could, like if it does go into one of its drawdowns and all of a sudden their balance sheet, if they over-index, let's say instead of 5% in a Bitcoin reserve, they were like a 50%, like let's say it did all of a sudden 5x and all of a sudden their balance sheet is super exposed or super, over allocated to that. And then they took on a bunch of debt because their balance sheet looks great. They were able to refinance a bunch of debt or whatever without selling any of the Bitcoin because their balance sheet is now this much more valuable, and then it draws down. That's why I'm just wondering of like, how do you guys have any kind of like internal, from like a risk mitigation strategy of we can accumulate up to X and we feel like that's, within our risk modeling for our balance sheet. Or is that not really a factor yet? I mean, you're still in the accumulation phase, but I just wonder if they're, how institutions are thinking about that, because it is, as you mentioned, and I think that seems right, is, it's probably gonna be volatile for a while.
Yeah, for our balance sheet, we don't have issues like that, but I think that is a fair point because, if you do have 10 billion and it goes down to 5 million and you had covenants that it could trip, there are risks associated with that. But the structure of our balance sheet, that hasn't been a concern. And so I don't have too many smart comments on that one.
Yeah. Yeah. You guys. Yeah. But for some of these that are already so over leveraged, and then, what few dollars they have left, they start accumulating that. If they even can, without even tripping covenants, because I don't know how the debt looks at. Like I know some of our debt documents that I've seen in some of these deals actually have like an exclusion. If you did have it, they would just net that out and not even consider that in the balance sheet for purposes of lending. And there's like prohibition around them actually using any of the proceeds for that. And I know obviously there are debt groups out there that are totally okay with that. Obviously, Strategy, as you mentioned, has accumulated a tremendous amount via debt instruments. So, yeah, I just think about it to your point in cannabis and the state of things for a lot of these companies. Who else really is in a position, to your point, outside of like a GTI? Yeah.
Yeah, and the only other comment, then we'll move on to some other stuff, is this is a pro-crypto administration, and I just kept hearing, the comments and the sentiments, with politicians at the conference, and it's really what we're dreaming of in cannabis. I mean, I was there for JD Vance speaking, which is a whole other conversation in terms of the Secret Service and everything associated with that. It was pretty fascinating to attend the VP's presentation, but he flat out said, crypto finally has a champion and an ally in the White House. Trump Media owns over 5 billion of Bitcoin. Vance himself owns around $500,000 in Bitcoin. Eric and Don Jr. co-founded a Bitcoin mining company. They have other ventures, including World Liberty Financial. And so, I just think I'd make the last comment just because it pertains so much to cannabis, that you're seeing a really pro-Bitcoin administration. And it was interesting to see Vance up there, absolutely pounding the table, saying crypto, including Bitcoin, finally has a champion and an ally in the White House. And both the president and the vice president own Bitcoin.
Yeah. And I know it was a Bitcoin conference, but are you familiar with the Genius Act? And was it talked about at all at the event, and where? No. Okay.
Yeah. There was I sat in on a panel that was equivalent of a safe banking panel for us. And so that felt a little bit like deja vu, talking about Operation Choke Point, with the difference being that they're actually doing something about it there.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a good event. I mean, it was super eye-opening, a lot of energy there. I wasn't in cannabis in 2018, and maybe I don't want to correlate the bubble aspects because I don't think Bitcoin is a bubble, but the energy, excitement, enthusiasm, people have money, people are doing deals. And so, yeah, it was a great event. I think they do it every year. This year is in Vegas. I'm not sure where it is next year, but if you're a crypto curious, Bitcoin curious person, definitely worth checking it out and spending a couple of days.
Nice. Good. Well, thanks for that rundown. It's there's so much we're chopping wood on here in cannabis, so it's good to get some outside perspectives, see what else is going on in the world. And I always love the tangents, the analogies, and just things that help you kind of give you just even more understanding of what's going on out there.
Yeah, it's been fun, man. Like I mentioned, when Leaf got interested in Bitcoin, that's when I got interested in Bitcoin, and since then I've been getting really up the education curve and following more and more of those accounts, and it's been a fun area to learn about. I kind of cleaned up my X feed a little bit from all the cannabis despair. There's a lot of fun Bitcoin conversation. And if anybody's interested in learning more, kind of the classic book is the Bitcoin Standard, and that's a good read. I liked one called Hard Money You Can't Fuck With, and that one is really good as well. But there's a few good Bitcoin books out there, and also a bunch of good Bitcoin podcasts. So if you're looking to learn a little bit more, maybe check out either of those books.
Very good.
Should we contrast that, Morgan, with Benzinga coming up?
Oh, sure. So you've got Benzinga next week. I think sounds like, I know they consolidated down to, because they didn't do Florida this year. So turnout sounds strong. I know there's a lot of good stuff going on. But what's your objectives for next week? What's going on for, is there a lot of other California companies going? Like, what's kind of the lay of the land for next week?
Yeah, it feels pretty well attended. I think when I was, I don't know if I was talking to Elliot or who I was talking to, but I think they were mentioning it was going to be, bigger than last year, which probably comes from, consolidating the two events. They usually do Chicago and Florida, and this year they're just doing the one big Chicago event. I'll be out there with our CEO, Micah, and our CFO, Kevin. So we'll have the whole team out there. I'm on a panel about mid-market growth companies. So talking about Leaf in the context of opportunities with kind of smaller and mid-sized type managers. Micah's on a panel talking about Bitcoin and incorporating that into cannabis. So a great topic for him to talk about it because he is about 10x more knowledgeable than me on Bitcoin. So when I go to conferences, I always appreciate a speaking role. Just helps kind of raise our presence in the community. So grateful that we're able to both get speaking roles this year. Also grateful I'm not moderating the keynote anymore. I moderated the keynote 3 years in a row, and that was, always an honor to do, the big presentation. I did it once with Jason, once with Kyle from Glasshouse, and also once with Charlie from Cresco. And that was cool, but man, I always was, the night before so nervous about it and up early and going over my notes and worrying about freezing in front of everybody in the opening presentation. And so it's kind of nice not to have that kind of role, although I did appreciate that opportunity when it happened. But so we're on a couple of panels out there. Put a ton of work in ahead of the conference to identify, productive meetings for us. So we want to meet with brand partners. Our business is producing extracts, and then we use those to power many of the top brands in California and starting to move into New York. So we want to meet with brands. We want to meet with investors and have found a couple of new investors in the space that reached out to us. So excited to talk to some fresh capital. And then also talking to people on the lending side, because we are a growing business. We want to grow, further expand our farm in California. We did 65 acres this year. We want to do the full 187 as soon as we can. And we also may be looking to do some expansion in New York. And so talking to some lenders as well. I think we have about a dozen one-on-ones set up, a couple of lunches, the usual cocktail parties. And I think it'll be fun. I think it'll be exhausting, but I think it's going to be a good couple of days.
Nice. And you guys are going to the Poseidon Mixer?
Absolutely. That's one of my favorites. So yeah, it'd be good to see Patrick, be good to see Emily, and was sad you're not going to be out there this year.
Yeah, but we'll be more than well represented with those two wonderful people. Well, before we move on from that, to your point of Leaf, I think you guys should get an award at Benzinga. I don't know if there's an award for this, but for high quality content, just the work you've been doing, it's been a real treat to follow along, and just the video quality, the really showcasing what you're doing, is I feel like it's a level up from what you see out there on a regular basis from other companies. So kudos to you guys for really leaning in on that, because I think it's a real differentiator.
Well, thanks. I really, really appreciate that. We've been working hard on it. It's kind of a combination of a couple of things. This was the year to do it, where Leaf has an awesome story to tell this year. So if I joined last year, I don't think I could have been as impactful. So the fact that we're planting the farm and going into New York gives us a ton to talk about. So that's been good. And also we have a great guy on our content team named Josh that does an awesome job putting those videos together. I made that one of my road trip out to the farm and just sent him, 9 different videos. And within a couple of days, he pieced it all together with great music and great edits. And so it's been fun. And yeah, I appreciate that, Morgan. What we're trying to do is show people what we're doing now. And so when the results show up later this year, we can point back and say, this is the arc that we went on. Cannabis is the ultimate show me story. And so, we've been one of the better performing stocks, over the past few months, which is nice. But really, people want to see results before I think we get that serious interest. So my mentality has been to come in this year, create a bunch of content, document the farm, document the harvest. And then once we start mixing that material that we grew into products in the third quarter, that'll show up in our financials, and then I think that'll even get some more eyes on our story. But yeah, I definitely appreciate that. I think one thing you've seen, Morgan, which I don't agree with, but is the way the industry is content is down in general. CEOs are doing fewer interviews. There's less videos. There's less interviews. There's just less stuff going on, and so it's been fun this year to kind of try to stand out in that regard and put ourselves out there. So appreciate the shout out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the plan for Benzinga. That's the review of the crypto, almost called it, the Bitcoin conference. And yeah, I think the last thing I'll say about Benzinga, I'll be curious to see what the vibes are like. Is there an energy about where we go next, or is it people talking about, how they wish things were different? And it feels kind of like a funeral. From the people I've been talking to, it seems like the vibes are pretty good and people are kind of positive and solution oriented. But that's kind of the last thing I'm keeping my eye on is the level of despair versus, perseverance and optimism.
It will be, I think you'll see a gamut, but
for sure.
Those that are still doing it and are doing pretty well feel okay.
Yeah.
I mean, from just conversations we have with our companies and, getting out there, and things are okay. You're just grinding away and focused on your business, and that's what matters. And, but if you're obviously in the hurt locker, it's really hard.
Yep.
And there's no doubt there's plenty of it out there. And I feel for people because it's been a hell of a cycle, and doesn't seem like we're done yet, as we'll, if we still get to it today, because I really enjoyed the Bitcoin conversation, so I didn't want to rush past that. But just what we've seen with earnings, we're still deep in the cycle. So yeah.
You want to jump in and chat about earnings? Maybe share a little bit about what you thought of the last round of Qs.
Yeah, I mean, we're technically done for those that should have reported, and most have. Minus some few, or one that I can think of, at least on my Pubco list, that is yet to report. It's
we can say the name. It's Air.
Yeah. Which interestingly, I get a debt run. I think I've mentioned before. I look at how the debt trades on these companies, as well as obviously how these common trade, and you look at GTI and Cureleaf, TrueLeaf, even and Ascend, who just did another 50 million of their debt financing. Their debt in a secondary trades really close to either the deal price or the or par. Some instances the asks are actually over par, because if they did borrow at a higher rate, and where the market is now, some of them can trade tighter to that, so it's actually at a premium to par. But Air's trading at like, last I saw was 45 to 55 cents on the dollar on their debt. So, I think if anyone's looking at the common, you're really, really taking a shot. And I understand there's a lot of inefficiencies, but if the debt isn't even trading that well, that usually means it's coming at a consequence of the common taking a severe impairment to right size the balance sheet. So, but we'll see.
I was just checking the market cap of Air. It's about 14 million right now.
And with an enterprise value probably still of 150 or something. I have no idea.
Yeah. Don't they have way more debt than that?
Probably. I'm just throwing a number out there. Because I haven't looked at the queue in a while, since we haven't had a queue, I haven't, doesn't stay front of mind for me. But yeah, I mean, so, earnings overall was tough. Of the 11 or 12 names I track, 3 of them had positive year-over-year growth in Q1. Only 3. Everyone else were down, I'd say on average, high single digit, maybe double digit on average year over year for Q1. Pretty tough. So, for those that are not aggressively cutting their costs, that operating leverage in reverse is really hitting their margin profile negatively. So, that was something that, tells me that we're still in the cycle. Does seem like the few analysts that do cover the space, they're seemingly, being feels like potentially more realistic about their look at the year, which unfortunately points to a picture of another year of overall sequential decline for several of these names. I think, the cohort on average, and this is even with Glass House's still pretty robust growth, my average is a negative 4% top line decline from 24 through 25. And this is at a time where rescheduling is stalled, uncertain tax policies are being adopted by everybody except for GTI. So those balances are growing. And just monitoring that, obviously, as it relates to rescheduling. So, yeah, I mean, it's tough because unit growth in a lot of markets positive. It's just the pricing cycle, and I don't know when we're going to get through that pricing cycle. There's no, the Mark Twain of history doesn't rhyme, but it often repeats itself. As we've been talking with some of our Canadian cohort, they went through that in a very vicious way and wiped out a lot of companies. Germany's really bailing them out for now. But we don't really have that, and we don't have federal bankruptcy. So, we just have companies that are getting pretty well stuck. To your point, they've had to throttle back a lot. They've kind of gone into some instances, gone into hiding, really cut back on their visibility and content. And I think for those that are in a position, this is a great time you can really stand out and shine. Because I think there's, incredible situations in this space. I think it's situation specific. Because overall there's just this halo until we get some stability. So yeah, that's kind of my overall view of the queue, and looking to this quarter that we're already in. I mean, what's to say it's going to change? I don't see why it would. I mean, Florida was a gem of a state, and now it's turned into a really tough, super competitive, oversaturated market with massive price declines. But there are some companies that are doing just fine there. But again, it's just, at a high level, was a huge positive contribution for companies that had exposure there, became a headwind.
Yeah, I think the opportunity for investors right now is not to buy the basket, but to find the baby that's getting thrown out with the bathwater, and be selective, because not everything is a total mess, but a lot of it is a bit of a mess. And so I would say I agree with most of your takeaways from the quarter there. At a high level, I'm a simple man, so I was just trying to look at kind of the high level and get the big picture right. And I think the simple problem we're facing right now is no growth and margin compression at the same time. And so I think back to this conversation we had with Nick, Can Investments. It was funny, Morgan, I texted Dick the other day about a different topic, and in my text, the first thing I said was, "Don't worry, I'm not going to invite you to come on to talk about earnings." So I'm like,
he does a great rundown, though.
Oh, he said, "No, Nick is the best." I'm just saying the poor guy probably doesn't, he's not as active in cannabis and probably doesn't want to come on and talk about the most recent quarters. But I do think back to our last conversation we had with Nick, and one of the things we talked about is the problem without new states turning on, like missing the Floridas, the Pennsylvanias, and, less so the Minnesotas, is that you don't have the revenue growth and you also don't have the healthier margins that those new states often offer. And so instead, we're stuck with no revenue growth or declining revenue growth and margin compression from existing states. And it's a simple point in some ways, but I think it's a super important point. And I think if you're an investor in these companies that have broad exposure to these states, you either are committing to be patient or you think something is going to change. Because if this continues, these are not going to be attractive investments. Fortunately, we have 24 adult use states, and eventually I think we'll get to 50. And so there's a lot of runway there. And I think we're just, as Abner talked about, that stair-step growth pattern. We're in one of these flat stairs, and eventually new states will turn on or something will change, and that will bump us up. But the current condition isn't a heck of a lot to be excited about. So my first thought was, there's no growth and margin compression is a serious issue. Cresco was delayed. Air still hasn't filed. That's not awesome. With Cresco, Morgan, I noted that, I was thinking back to those Benzinga keynotes that I did, and I think the last one was with Charlie, if I recall correctly. And we talked a lot about that year of the core, and Charlie talked about it wasn't just year of the core is who we are. And so I think it was 23 was the first year of the core, and then 24 executed again. But as we come into 25, there's only so much G&A you can cut. I think we talk about this with a lot of the CEOs, Morgan, where it's like, okay, you want to cut expenses, but how do you cut expenses without having worse flower and, less service at dispensaries, fewer workers? Like, how do you just, everyone says go out there and get leaner and cut costs, but how do you cut costs without damaging the business? And I think that's where we're getting to with some of these companies is, sure, you could cut costs and lay people off, but just like there's a creative dilution, you can start cutting costs that ultimately are more detrimental to cut because your flower quality goes down, your service goes down, whatever else, gets compromised with the business. And it seems with a lot of these businesses, they did those big cuts over 23 and 24. And here we are in 25 with no revenue growth, margin compression, and not much room to keep cutting. And so in the case of Cresco, G&A went up 7% year over year, while revenue went down 10%. Yeah. So I don't think it's clever to say it's not a super compelling situation right now for these companies. It's always about where we go from here and how much of this is priced in. And so, I don't think we're breaking news about the situation here. So if you're, on the other side of this, you could say, yes, that's all true, Jesse, but this is all known information and priced in. So it's all about the future. And I would say you're probably right. But we are in a harder period and it's not super clear when it's going to end. So those were the negatives. If you asked me to look at the positives, Morgan, the quarter, and you kind of already mentioned it, I think Glass House, continues to shine. They had another strong quarter. They're, bringing online that new greenhouse, which is the mixed light facility. And it sounds like that's going to be dedicated to Farm Bill flower, THCA flower. So that's another potential growth engine there. So that was the name that stood out with being one of the stronger quarters. But overall, not a super great quarter. I shouldn't even say not super great. It was not a good quarter for most companies. And I don't know when that changes. I think we can predict why it changes. The why could be due to reform, Farm Bill stuff, or it could be due to states turning on. But it's unclear whether either of those things are going to happen. And so I think it's fair, like you said, Morgan, to expect more of the same for the second quarter results.
Right. And there's still, these companies are still finding cost savings. I still think there's a ways to go for a lot of them. There may be some less sophisticated teams that are struggling to find those efficiencies, but I can tell you just, again, from work we do in the industry and with our companies that are helping these companies find a lot more costs coming out of them. And that is a positive because they are just becoming better businesses. Now, I will say that with a caveat to your point is that you want to be not cutting muscle. And if you're sacrificing quality, all you're doing is impairing your business because you're going to lose the customer, right? And those, I think, that are super customer focused in making sure that they're delivering what their customer is seeking are those that have a better shot of, making it through because they will stand versus those that just are trying to cut everything without really a good plan around it or understanding. To your point, they're going to degrade the quality, and they're going to lose a customer, and they're just going to chase themselves. And back to the old saying of you can't cut your way to growth, and that comes to mind for sure for that kind of cohort of folks. But there still is more to go, I think, for these companies, and they keep driving that down, and that is all good for the future for those that do make it, because they will become that much more efficient. And when things do stabilize and that headwind subsides, so much more of those dollars have the ability to fall through to the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe Cresco was early. Like Cresco, I think, started maybe cutting a little bit earlier, and so maybe they got leaner than some of the others. So the others could maybe have more room to cut than Cresco has left. But that's a good point that you made.
Yeah.
Anything else on earnings, Morgan?
Nope, I don't think so. I'm trying to think. There's nothing was earth shattering to me that really was like, wow, this is something totally unique and different from, to your point, like Glass House is a very unique story, I'd say, in the Pubco universe. So
GTI missed most of the missed expectations, if I recall. So maybe that was something that it still was an okay quarter, but I think this was the first time in a long time they came in below consensus on multiple metrics.
Yeah, that's right.
So I've been a bad podcast host, Morgan, and I skipped ahead in the agenda. So do you want to circle back and touch maybe on the Boies Schiller Flexner lawsuit for a minute?
Yeah. So let me get back up to that. So this came out, my time is a little fuzzy, it was a week or two ago. Marijuana Moment did a pretty good job covering it. We got the opinion back so if you all remember, in December, the First Circuit Court of Appeals held a hearing on the Canon Provisions v. Garland case, which is the industry basically suing the Attorney General and seeking to get federal protection, call it, of intra-state legal activities, and saying that their current application of the Controlled Substances Act is unfair, unjust, which I don't think anyone would argue that, but you got to go through the process of actually pursuing the legal path, the judicial path. So we got the opinion back from the court finally. Took quite a bit longer than we were thinking after the hearing, because I was there, and I was there with the Boies team, which was an incredible experience. But so we got the opinion back, and basically the court said the First Circuit affirmed the district court's dismissal of our claims. Means that the Court of Appeals agreed with the district court's decision that plaintiffs failed to state a claim upon which relief could be granted. Now that sounds negative, but if all of you remember back to when we were starting this case and everything, we didn't want to win at the circuit court level, because if we won there, we would be stuck in the circuit court level. We needed to actually lose this case to then be able to appeal to the Supreme Court. And so this was kind of the outcome we were wanting. And take this with a grain of salt, because I have not had a full debrief with the Boies team, but this is, from my memory, kind of what we were wanting to have happen a little bit.
Yeah, that's consistent with my memory too. Yeah.
The court also concluded that the appellants did not plausibly allege that the CSA's prohibition of our activities violate the Fifth Amendment's due process clause. So just again, this was the court's opinion. So where do we go from here? The next step is for the plaintiffs to seek a review by the Supreme Court via a writ of certiorari. I'm not brushed up on my Latin, but I think that's kind of how you say it. And I believe this to be correct, is that from here we have, from the day we got this opinion, we have 90 days to make that filing. And then from there, the Attorney General files a response. So it's typically 30 days after that. So assuming it takes us the full 90 plus 30, depending on all of that, then we're in a position to, make that official appeal to the Supreme Court. So it usually takes the Supreme Court some time, right? They gather all the cases that are eligible to be heard by them, they review them and decide which ones they're going to hear. So right now, given when we received this outcome, it's looking like probably early next year.
Mm-hmm.
That is our would be, I'd say, an objective of when we can get that potential hearing. Just because we're appealing doesn't mean we're going to be heard. But this is the shot that we've been wanting to get. The Supreme Court takes into several factors when thinking about what cases to hear. I think the one that stood out to me the most is it of national importance?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how that would not be a very significant weighting, just given the situation in this country, given the size of this industry, how many states have legalized and both medical and adult use, because this is really, again, this is intrastate. We're not trying to say like one versus the other. We're just saying, the cannabis is legal on an intrastate basis. So yeah, TBD there, but all in all, I'd say that's, kind of the outcome we were looking for, and now it gives us a shot at the next steps. And when we think about this again in relation to other various matters, whether it's rescheduling, whether it's, a congressional banking reform, which seems, nowhere to be found, and rescheduling is unfortunately stalled. There's a lot of things going on in this country. Again, it's good to be pushing on all fronts, but it's just really nice that we do have this judicial path that is still moving, and we have a way to keep progressing that as another pressure point to try to create historical and meaningful change for legal cannabis in the United States.
And so it could be heard, Morgan, if all went well by the Supreme Court early next year. We're just talking ballpark dates here. And then how long would that hearing take, and how long would a decision take? Like, could that all be a 26 type event?
It's a good question. I think I'm speculating because I didn't do my homework beyond that point. I was focused on getting to that point of the Supreme Court, but I think that would be possible. But I'm speculating. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm just putting myself in terms of if I'm a cannabis investor listening to this and trying to figure out my key takeaways. I would say going well so far, kind of where you want to be, which is a little bit hard to get your head around. But yeah, being rejected by the district court was actually what you guys wanted. And so now you get a chance at the Supreme Court. So in a way, everything is on track. It's taking time, could be heard early next year. And Morgan, if successful, could you just reiterate what the benefits of this would be?
Oh man, it's everything. You're talking about no 280E applicability. You're talking about full banking capabilities because it's federally recognized activity on an intrastate basis. You're talking about capital markets. You're talking about everything because we would be, federally legal businesses. So it's really just it does everything that this industry needs. It basically means that we are treated as real businesses and not as pariah. So, so it's a profound implication for cannabis. And so this is, obviously there's work to be done, and looking for the industry to continue to be great advocates and supporters of this initiative. Boys Schiller is a fantastic team. Can't ask for a better team, really, to be trying to go to the Supreme Court. It's a great, actually, construct of a Supreme Court for states' rights matter like this. So, we have a lot of good pieces in place. It was very intentional when the committee that put this whole thing together in the first place wanted to make sure that they were looking at all these different pieces and the probabilities, and it just felt like it was all lining up. So we'll see. I mean, it's obviously not, we're in the process now, but I know I've said it before and I'll say it again. It's just this remains the piece that gets me the most excited about potential reform for U.S. cannabis.
Yeah, it's nice to be going through the judicial system, and I think it's worth saying thank you again to people like you, your sister. I know Emily's done a ton of work. I remember being on fundraising calls for that, which feels like almost 2 years ago at this point, and that probably was I probably
It
wasn't
was.
super early, so it's probably been going on even longer than that. I know guys like Jason Wild have been real active. The team at Verano, of course, and so there's been a ton of time and effort that's gone into this. So thanks to you guys for doing that, and appreciate the update on what's going on there.
Yes. Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, Morgan, we had a whole nother part to the agenda where we were going to talk about
I know.
hemp, but I think in the spirit of time, you want to leave this here for today, and we can keep that on the agenda for next time we circle up.
Yes. Yeah, I do realize we're over time and I am late. So for
Okay.
another meeting. So yeah, we're gonna have to hold it here.
Okay. Well, good to catch up with you, my friend. I missed you. It was a lonely few weeks without you, and enjoyed today's conversation.
Yeah, same here for sure.
Okay. Well, cool. Thank you guys all for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. The views expressed in this podcast are provided for informational purposes. Nothing we say should be considered research nor a recommendation. All investing involves risk, including the loss of principal.